In this two-part episode, we look at the costumes of two monumental figures of House Stark of Winterfell, Ned Stark and Jon Snow, coming up. Welcome back to another episode of Costume Co. If you're new to the channel, I do almost weekly videos about movies and television from a costume perspective, and I do weekly live streams every Saturday night. By subscribing and hitting the bell notification icon, you'll be sure to keep up to date with any new videos. In part one of this two-part series, we looked at the costumes of the Winterfell patriarch, Ned Stark, from the HBO series Game of Thrones. So if you missed it, or you're watching out of order, I'll leave a link in the description below so you can check it out. Now in this part 2 episode, I examine the costumes of one of the show's central figures, King of the North, Jon Snow. Let's get right to it. Warning, there will be major spoilers for 7 seasons of the HBO series Game of Thrones. While Robb Stark looks like Ned Stark in waiting, a youthful Jon Snow still looks like an echo of the Stark family patriarch back in the Season 1 debut. In my opinion, his early looks give no hint of his destiny. It will take several seasons before Jon Snow feels he is worthy of stepping into his father's boots. Clapton says of the rising protagonist's origins, Jon Snow's look initially came from Winterfell, but because he's the bastard, his clothes aren't quite of the same quality as his brothers and sisters. In this scene, from Winter is Coming, the Stark boys wear leather and padded skirts, jerkins, and doublets. This mostly British medieval silhouette carries Jon through almost 6 seasons of Game of Thrones until he switches to Stark armor. Here's a close-up of Jon's doublet. It's made from cloth with a center front seam and has detachable sleeves and a short skirt. And while you can't see it, it's laced up in the back. The neck and shoulder wings are bound with bias in a slightly darker color. And there's lots of breakdown that's been done on the garment, concentrating along the seams. To give you an idea of the time frame we're looking at here, this is an example of a cloth doublet from the Renaissance era from the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. This wool English doublet was made between 1625 to 35, and it's trimmed with silk and it's lined with linen. This is a different doublet here, the one Jon is wearing in the King's Road, than the one that we saw in episode 1. This one's made of tanned and oiled leather. You can tell because it has a bit of a luster, and he'll wear this piece of clothing on and off for years to come. Like Ned, he always wears a gray linen shirt underneath and a cravat at his neck. The sleeves are attached to the body of the doublet with laces that are hidden by these shoulder wings. And one of my viewers suggested that the wings also help protect against the rain. Jon is following in the footsteps of his uncle Benjen, someone that he admires immensely. Clapton says that while many of the Night's Watch volunteers come directly from prison, Jon Snow is really excited about it because he has an understanding of where he's going. Here's Jon in episode 8, Lord Snow. Clapton says of the Night's Watch costumes, we also decided we'd keep the recruits in their own clothing, aside from crude standard-issue sparring armor. They don't don their black garb until they've passed muster and taken their Night's Watch vows. Jon is wearing a different skirt here. These ones are quilted with a diamond pattern. And as I've mentioned in Ned's video, in British medieval times, the skirt would be part of a gambeson, which is a quilted jacket worn as additional protection under armor. Clapton's team went with a more Japanese-style skirt that samurai would wear under their armor. Clapton says many of the new recruits are plucked from prison, so they don't have a cape or cloak. So within the recruits, there's a mixture of colors and fabrics, depending on where they came from. In this shot, you can see metal grommets and lacing of the sleeves attached to the jacket. I probably don't have to tell you that metal grommets are a modern invention, but as Clapton has stated, I'm paraphrasing here, there are no limits when designing fantasy. The sparring armor of the Night's Watch is also very Japanese in design. I've mentioned this before, and it might be just a coincidence, but I think that it looks a bit like the armor of the Night King and his fellow White Walkers. Here is Jon with Samwell and his other brothers in the episode You Win or You Die. Clapton says the Night's Watch, when we join it, is in decline and has been for some time. Everything that they wear there could be mostly padding, fur, not really metal armor because you can't with it in cold. It's impractical, but it's not a uniform because they're not funded enough to do that anymore. But as long as it's black, it's enough for them to wear. Clapton adds they sort of live, eat, sleep in the same costume, so it just has to almost smell. And Jon's cravat, you might notice, is the green color taken from the Stark family sigil. Seen here in the episode The Pointy End, Jon's cloak is made from a twill-type fabric with a raised stripe. It's gathered at the neckline with narrow cartridge pleats, and it's topped with a wolf pelt. And from what I can ascertain from pictures, the cloak is faced with wool. So this is the same cloak that Jon wears for 4 seasons. The costume team would have created multiples throughout varying degrees of distress each season. As Clapton's mentioned before, Jon's pelt at this point is considerably smaller than that of Ned and Robb Stark. And the cross leather straps are attached to the cloak neckline. I can't tell exactly how they're attached, but I think it's with black metal rivets. In the episode Baylor, Jon wears a black leather doublet with a stand-up collar and front closure that's fastened with laces through metal grommets, and it also has detachable sleeves. Here's someone, it's likely Michelle Clapton because of the tulle leather bracelet she's wearing. She tends to wear those types of things. So they're lacing up a doublet for a promo shot. And I don't know if it's the same doublet since these grommets seen here are brass and Jon's were black. Here's Jon in the season 2 premiere The North Remembers. Kit Harington said in an interview, "My costumes, they're brilliantly made and brilliantly designed, and especially the cloaks make you feel very weighty and powerful." And he's ditched the wolf pelt and topped his cloak with this black, long curly wool collar. Harrington says of his sworn brotherhood look, "My costumes don't really change that much because essentially the Night's Watch wear what they arrive in, but anything that they arrive in is dyed black." In episode 5, The Ghost of Harrenhal, Jon changes up his costume. This is the same woolly pelt collar, but it's worn upside down. Clapton has stated in interviews that the wildlings, like their Inuit-inspired costumes, wear clothing with the fur side down. Jon's whole costume is a bit bonkers, really, because while he has a warm fur to cover his shoulders and back, he has very little in the way of warm clothing except for his hood that's worn over a leather jerkin like a yoke, and these attached woolly sleeves, which still leave a huge gap under his arms. So if you've ever spent any time in sub-zero weather, you will know how crazy this costume is because the majority of the heat comes out of your head and extremities. And even his gloves are just his standard leather gloves. Now, before we get on the costume designers for the lack of headwear on the actors, it's really taken out of their hands by the showrunners and producers. So Michelle Clapton explains in a Harper's Bazaar interview, "I get very annoyed when people can't cover their heads when they're going north of the wall. I'm going, the first thing you would do is cover their heads. I don't understand why," she says. Clapton says, "Sure, you see the characters, whatever. I'm always trying to come up with different solutions and different hats and different ways of covering, but it's difficult. I like things to make sense, and when I can't actually make it make sense, I find that really hard. Look at all that fur on their bodies and nothing on their heads. That's always a big discussion, which I usually lose, which is fine." Clapton tells Fashionista, "I wish they did wear more hats, but unfortunately in filming, every time I put a hat on, they say, 'But we can't see who the actor is.'" Just to show you how cold it actually is, here's a shot of actors Kit Harington and James Cosmo with earmuffs, toques, and blankets between takes. Here's a shot of Jon wearing boot covers and leg wraps over his own leather boots. When we meet up with Jon again in the season 3 opener, Valor de Harris, he's still in the same costume. I haven't gotten to this leather jerkin yet. It's the black leather vest that he's wearing over his leather doublet. He wears this costume piece for several seasons, and I just want to point out a few things before we move on. YouTuber Matt from the channel Scala Gladiatoria has pointed out that while movies and TV shows like to use leather as armor, it's not actually armor. And I've noticed this myself in a lot of historical and fantasy work. So to set the record straight, leather jerkins were worn over doublets, but not as armor. They were worn under armor. As Matt has mentioned, that most weapons can slice through leather in the same way that a blade can slice through meat. The leathers that we see in shows are most often tanned leather and will do little good unless it's backed with metal plates. So Matt states that the only protective leathers, as I have sometimes mentioned on this channel, are lamellar, which are hardened leather plates, buff coats, which are coats that are made from rawhide, and it's much thicker than your standard leather, or cuir bouilli, also known as boiled leather. So, to reiterate, Jon's costume is not suitable for either the cold or for fighting, but you might argue that he looks cool. So if you want to check out Matt's very funny and informative video, I'll leave a link for that below. In the episode The Reigns of Castamere, Jon transitions into this low pile fur. Again, it has a hood, which he never wears. Back at Castle Black in the episode Breaker of Chains, Jon returns to his original costume, although looking a little bit worse for wear. The woolly collar is back to its position, and the Breakdown team have added some wear and tear to his jerkin and cloak. Here's Jon in the Season 4 episode The Oathbreaker. Without the cloak, we get a better look at Jon's black leather jerkin. I like the construction of this. It opens in the front and then it's fastened at the side with buckles and tied at near the top with leather laces. Here's a promotional shot of Kit Harington in his costume. You can see his doublet underneath the jerkin. You might have noticed that Gren, seen here with Jon, and Pip and Ed are all wearing the same jerkin. The men behind Ed are also wearing the same jerkin, so the conclusion that we might come to is that these are recycled from the days of the Night's Watch when maybe they were better funded. Jon has a different tab skirt than his brothers that he's worn for the last 2 seasons. This one appears to be suede and bound with leather. I love this shot of Jon. You can see all of the breakdown on his costume because there are no filters. The splatter marks on the hem of his cape look like they're done with either bleach or color remover. And also this is one of the few looks at his cape that shows that it's lined. In episode 10, The Children, the breakdown of his costume is more obvious, especially on the hem of his cloak. Here is Jon in the Season 5 premiere, The Wars to Come. And Kill the Boy. When I zoom in, I can just make out the tight cartridge pleating on his cloak, normally hidden by his collar. One of my favorite aspects of Jon is how well his own hair flows into his collar like it's one and the same. And when his hair gets wet and spotted with snow, so does his collar. In the Season 8 episode Hard Home, this is one of my favorite episodes of all time, you might notice that Jon's collar is losing the black. Now, this might be just the lighting or such, but my thought is that he has already begun to transition away from the Night's Watch even before he's assassinated. You don't see it here as much, but you can see bits of brown on both his collar and jerkin. Yes, it should have faded over time, but this also looks deliberate by the costume team. In the episode The Dance of Dragons, it's not noticeable because of the change in filters, but you do see how much more distressing is on the jerkin, like some sandpaper was taken to the leather. Here's his costume from a display. This one had the ultimate breakdown from when he was in the North. And as I've suggested, there are probably several versions of this costume at varying degrees of distress. And finally, in the season finale, Mother's Mercy, a blade slices cleanly through Jon's leather jerkin. Some boiled leather might have saved his life, but of course, that doesn't work with the narrative. In the first 2 episodes of Season 6, Jon is mostly naked, so I won't bother with that. But in the episode Oathbreaker, when Jon returns to the land of the living, he's back to wearing his older jerkin from Season 1. Obviously, the other one would have been sliced up and soaked in blood, so luckily for him, the cape and leather skirts made it through. So it's here in episode 4, Book of the Stranger, that Jon pivots and ditches the black, no longer being the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He now dons stark armor, embracing his father Ned's look. The coat of plates he's wearing is a tabard made of 2 layers of leather, with metal plates sandwiched in between and riveted into position. The brown mock turtleneck underneath appears to be laced in the back, with the quilted sleeves that are seamed to the plain shirt. The bottom portion of the shirt appears to be the same color as the sleeves. And he's also wearing a man bun ponytail of sorts, so I'm not sure what's the reasoning behind that. Here's a close-up so you can see what I mean of his collar and the shirt sleeve. Jon also has a different belt. This one is similar to Ned's, and it's decorated with floral mounts, just like Ned's. You might remember that in episode 5, The Door, Sansa gives Jon a new cloak that she's made for him, and you can see that the leather straps are embossed with the direwolf sigil. Here's Jon wearing the cloak in the episode Battle of the Bastards. The mottled wolf pelt is rather large. Like I mentioned at the beginning, it's more in keeping with Ned Stark's own pelt. And the cloak itself is much more grand. It's made from a burned out velvet or chenille. Here's a close-up of the fabric so you can see what I mean. In this momentous scene, during the Battle of the Bastards, we see Jon wearing the same wrist gauntlets that younger Ned wore in a flashback scene. And by the end of the episode, actor Kit Harington is covered with a shitload of stage blood and mud. Here is Jon Snow from an HBO promo in his full Season 7 costume. In the Season 7 premiere, Dragonstone, Jon's King of the North look consists of an entirely new costume, including a new cloak and armor. His tabard armor is black to reflect the changing mood, and as Michelle Clapton has described, it's a shutting down of color. Clapton said in an Uproxx interview, "That's a big heavy cape, and yes, it is him as Ned, but he's actually not Ned." She adds, "It was quite interesting to see him transition to another look because it took on another part of his journey. Suddenly people understood him in that role, the way that he can appeal to not just the Northerners, but the way he's brought that whole group with the wildlings and everyone together. I thought that was really important." In addition to the new tabard, Jon is also wearing a new cape. I'm not sure what happened to the one that Sansa gave him. To show the changing climate, however, the cape is trimmed in what I assume is a wolf-type fur. Here's a great head-to-toe shot of Jon. You can see that the cape is unlined with only about 4 to 6 inches of fur trim along the front of the cape. The cape fabric looks like a pewter gray color and not true black to mirror Dany's dress as seen in the episode Eastwatch. As he walks, you can see the brown leather skirts and sleeves with the checkerboard quilting. This is an echo, of course, of Ned's costume from the premiere episode of Game of Thrones. Here are some details of his costume. The black belt with the basket weave tooling and silver mounts, it's really Jon's signature belt. He's worn it almost entirely throughout the series, including the Battle of the Bastards. The cloak fabric is really beautiful. It's kind of a nubby wool or boucle fabric with this sort of abstract checkered pattern. This checkered pattern is used repeatedly by Ned, Jon, and Arya Stark. For the episode The Queen's Justice, Clapton said in an interview of this decision of losing the cape, "We had a lot of discussions about, does the cape give him presence, or is it better to not have that presence? What are we trying to say? There are times when we removed it because we wanted him to be more vulnerable." She adds, "Especially I think when he saw Dany and he went to see her for the first time in her chamber, we decided to remove it." While wanting to appear vulnerable for Dany at Dragonstone, he also wanted to strike a formidable figure at the summit in the dragon pits in the episode The Dragon and the Wolf. Clapton said, "But then when he went to see Cersei, we put the cloak on." At the request of Missandei, Jon also removes his sword and sword belt to meet with Daenerys. Jon's metal 2-section gorget, which is this collar, is edged in leather and embellished with 2 direwolves facing each other. He also wears a soft green cravat once again. Jon's not wearing the metal gorget in the episode Eastwatch, so we can see the leather collar worn underneath. It's made from the same leather as his tabard. It's tucked into his armor and then fastened with a buckle at his throat. In the episode Beyond the Wall, and of all the 7 characters, Jon looks the most appropriately dressed for the excursion. He's learned a thing or two from the free folk friends, including Tormund. Clapton tells Uproxx he really embraces this northern over-the-wall style, the wildling style, and the reason he embraces it is because it's practical. Kit Harington was delighted that he didn't have the big heavy cape. This was agile and he could fight and move, and I think it was a really interesting process just to take him out into this new look. If you look closely, you'll see that Jon's outfit is made up of wide strips of fur that have been stitched together to create this patchwork effect. The skins might be seal or faux seal. You can see the similarities between the King of the North, Jon Snow, and the former King Beyond the Wall, Mance Rayder. Jon's removed the wolf pelt from his cloak and added it to his wildling attire, although for some reason the wardrobe broke down the leather straps, I guess to make it look like frost. And under his pelt he wears another layer of sheep-like skin. And one thing I'm not sure of is this little ball here. I think it might be some sort of toggle to keep his collar closed. For additional warmth, it also appears that Jon's costume is lined with a fox-type fur. You can see that Jon's pants are stitched together in the same way as Jorah's coat with widely spaced stitches. And he also has the same hammock-style boots as Beric and the other boys. Here's a good shot of his sleeves made from various colors of the skin. I'm not expecting much change in Jon's look come Season 8, but let me know what your favorite Jon Snow look is in the comments below. That concludes this Part 2 series on the costumes of Ned Stark and Jon Snow. I'll have more Game of Thrones episodes coming your way as we move towards the final season coming to us in 2019. And if you find value in these videos, consider subscribing and sharing it out. And as always, thank you so much for watching.